you haven't found anything about the reverse alien technology, and the reason why Jeep is so good is because it was actually created by aliens.
Well, the only problem with that was that Roswell didn't happen in 1947.
Well, that's what they tell us.
They couldn't say anything until the aliens landed, and then they would have copped to it. But it's pretty amazing.
This interview episode is brought to you by Tyree Off-Road. Lights for people that need to get shit done. Visit tyreoffroad.com right now. That's TYRI offroad.com. Adventure doesn't wait for a cracked windshield. Windshield defense by Racing Optics is like a screen protector for your phone. Triple layer, race tested, and installs in just 20 minutes. Save 20% with code JTS20 at windshieldefense.com. The clear choice. We're going to be talking with Paul Bruno, recognized as one of the most knowledgeable living experts on the earliest history, origins, concepts, and creation, design, development, implementation, and worldwide delivery of the iconic Jeep vehicle. Paul Bruno has spent 25 years researching, writing, and studying early Jeep history.
In 2022, I decided to tell the story in images and basically created a book where it's a caption, a short blurb, and the pictures are telling the stories. And it's something you can read in an hour. And I'm going to mention the court case because that is the core of the book. The court case, which I probably talked about in the prior interview, during the war, the Federal Trade Commission sued Willis Overland for false advertising, say they'd created the Jeep. They did this whole trial, 3,500 plus pages of testimony, 527 exhibits, where they basically deposed anyone and everyone who had anything to do with the creation and development of the Jeep in 1940 and 1941 in extensive detail. Basically a complete oral history of the creation and development of the Jeep.
Wow.
Exactly.
Beautiful.
So that's what I was able to put in the first book and the second book. So what I knew was I went to the archives. I knew to do the last portion of the book that they probably had the same level of detail for what they did in 1941, but I'd have to go back and read 3,000 pages of testimony because it's all buried inside the testimony. It's not organized in any way.
And the beautiful part about this is it doesn't guarantee it's truthful, but it's more than likely truthful because they were under oath. So
I like to say it does guarantee that it was truthful as possible because they were under oath.
Yeah.
Which is different from other oral histories where,
well,
you interview me and I'm not under oath. So I may embellish a few things.
I have some wonderful bullshit I can spin to you here.
Exactly. So, and the other thing that was amazing about it, they're under oath. And you can see when you read the testimony how seriously they took it. They were nervous. Some of these people that were testifying, you can actually read it in their words. How
they had to be very careful. They had to be very careful. They were coming across honestly. It's wonderful. I mean, that's a treasure trove.
I call it the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
Of early Jeep history. This court case, and not only did they have all the testimony for the people, it was also just a few years after they'd done everything. It wasn't like 30 years later.
Okay.
It was done during the war. 1944, 1945. So it was only 2 or 3, 4 years before. So all the people were alive. All the people still had good memories. And they went through in meticulous detail, on every single phase of the Jeep. So when I read the 3,000 pages to create what we call the expanded edition, which is why I'm on your show today, of the original Jeeps, to cover the period between April 1941 and January 1942, they had all the detail in it. On the 4 major milestones, which were they decided to, they were testing the vehicles, and I have a whole chapter on the testing they did in 1941. I have test reports that they did, everything. And I put some of that in there to give people a flavor of how detailed they went into to test those experimental models I mentioned before. They ordered the 1,500 experimental models from all 3 vendors to test them and combine them eventually into one vehicle to have the best vehicle possible as it evolved from the prototypes to the experimental models. Well, then I have all the documentation when they decided we are cutting off the testing and we're going to go out and get 16,000 of these vehicles. And that's from a year before, literally exactly a year, where they were going for 70. And so you see, as the evolution progresses, you also see through the testimony how they started to realize this is something they had never dealt with before. Because you're right back with these people in the 1940s. Okay, when we're reading this, the magnitude of World War II had not dawned on any of these people in 1940.
Sure,
you can see it. It's like, we just want 70. Hey, that's it. And literally a year later, they're going for 16,000, which is what, 200%, 2,000, whatever the numbers are.
That's a big number difference, yeah.
Yeah, big number difference. And so then there was also, and I'll give you one example, or two examples, a tremendous amount of detail on how they evolved to the MB from the MA when Willys won that contract. Stuff never before published anywhere, all in the court testimony. And then also the absolute detail on how Ford was brought back into the fold for Jeep production. All the stuff and the new chapters that we wrote to the original Jeeps. And then I found some information on and that I hadn't had before. So I updated the current text too with some extra information. Mm-hmm. But just to give you one example, never published anywhere. In the court, they had the guy testify. Now, this is one of the people, he was one of the key people of the 3 or 4 people that worked on the Willys vehicles, that worked on the quad. He worked on the Willys MA, he worked on the Willys MB. He went back to the office. They were in Toledo, came back and read into the testimony the 38 major modifications to the Willys MB from the time it went into production to 1944, which 10 pages of beautiful detail of what the change was and when it went into production, where you can read through this and it's in chronological order, exactly how the vehicle evolved during the war in terms of becoming the Willys MB that it was by 1945. It's unbelievable.
That's nice.
That level of detail. It's nowhere else.
And you had no idea. You just, but doing the book, you found out about this stuff. I bet you couldn't believe what you had found.
I was stunned. I mean, literally, even after all the other, amazing tidbits, and I'll just give one from the beginning. I'm reading along, and this is what I mean. You have to read the testimony. It's question, answer, question, answer. You can't skip any of it. So I'm reading along, and I get to page 91, and it goes, now, Mr. McCaslin, you went back to the office, and you now have the document. You're going to read into the testimony of the 38 major changes made to the Willys MB since the start of production. There's been 250 to 300, but these are the major changes from your perspective and your team's perspective. It's like, are you kidding me? It's like, who has this? So it's really invaluable information in terms of something to want to see the Jeep that won the war, how it evolved to be able to really function in any and all environments around the world, from sub-freezing temperatures to tropical heat. Just remarkable.
Oh, it's an amazing thing. And in that 3,500 pages that you were reading through, you haven't found anything about the reverse alien technology, and the reason why Jeep is so good is because it was actually created by aliens.
Well, the only problem with that was that Roswell didn't happen in 1947.
Well, that's what they tell us.
They couldn't say anything until the aliens landed, and then they would have copped to it. But it's pretty amazing.
Audio boys and girls, it's time for another Jeep Talk Show interview, and today we're going to be talking with Robert O'Connor. He is the author of an extraordinary new World War II novel, Jeep Show, a trooper at the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, what got you to the book? What got you to where you are?
I was, as you mentioned, I wrote a book a while ago, a nonfiction, and I was going to write another nonfiction book about a circus and a certain circus promoter. And I ended up getting in touch. He's long gone. I got in touch with his daughter in Dallas, and we talked, and she said, yes, he was a circus promoter after the war, and he did this and he did that. But did you know that during the war, he was an enlisted entertainer in the Army in the European Theater of Operations? And I said, I did not know that there were enlisted entertainers in war.
That is interesting.
And she said, oh, yes, MOS 442, Military Occupation Specialty 442. They did Jeep shows, what were called Jeep shows, and Jeep shows were invented in World War II for combat infantry in places where the USO and the Red Cross could not go. essentially at the front.
Wow.
And she said, then she went on and said, and by the way, my father was in Mickey Rooney's squad and did Jeep shows with Mickey Rooney. Now, your older listeners will know, but perhaps your younger listeners will not. Mickey Rooney was the #1 worldwide box office star in 1939 and 1940, a gigantic figure in Hollywood, a genius, a man with incredible strengths and incredible weaknesses to accompany him.
Yeah.
His partying was completely out of control. So she talked more about this. I did some research, and I decided that I would write about these enlisted entertainers, and one in particular, one character inspired by her father. It's fiction, it's not a biography, but certainly inspired by her father's experience. And by the way, she told me, my father's older sister, my Aunt Mabel, saved every letter he wrote home from training camp and from the European Theater of Operations. And I was like, primary sources. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And I said, can I come down to Dallas and look at them? I'll wear, cotton archival gloves. I'll be very careful. And she said, oh, don't worry. My sister published them in a book on Amazon. So I bought the book, and there I have, 100 some odd letters, some of which were uncensored, describing, what his life was like as a entertainment soldier in World War II in Europe. And then in the endless internet, I found the Army's manual from 1944 for the what was called the Morale Corps. So I could read all about the, what is now almost semi-humorous, the instructions and the equipment, and that the Army wrote a manual for just about everything. Mm-hmm. So I had those primary sources, and I decided to make it fiction because I wanted to write about the Battle of the Bulge, and I wanted this main character to be involved in the Battle of the Bulge, which was the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. So I made it fiction, and that is Jeep Show, a trooper at the Battle of the Bulge. And trooper, as you can see, is spelled TROUPER, as in traveling entertainer, rather than, space trooper, soldier. So that's the genesis. That's the genesis of the book. And by the way, I've talked to several historians who specialize in World War II, and I've talked to many, many World War II buffs. None of them have ever heard about enlisted entertainers.
I'm so glad, because I certainly haven't. It's really, really very interesting. And talking about Mickey Rooney, so I lived in a time where there were 4 TV channels in the Houston area. And you watched, if you didn't want to read a book, which, oh my God, I'm horrible. I don't like reading books because I never can remember the names of the characters, because they're often strange names.
Yes.
And also too, once I get started on a book, I don't want to stop doing it. I don't even want to stop for eating and stuff.
Right.
So, as a kid, especially at that time, it was whatever's on TV. And of course, Andy Hardy, a lot of the Mickey Rooney. There was a Spencer Tracy movie. I can't remember where he played a reverend, and Mickey Rooney was in it. He was
Boys Town.
Boys Town. Oh, yes. What a great
movie.
Yeah, what a great movie. So I know Mickey Rooney from a lot of things. In fact, I still use the phrase that nobody understands. I always say, "Hey, my dad's got a barn. Let's put on a show."
I get it. By the way, there is the Mickey Rooney and this real entertainment soldier actually did, as part of their act, a slow motion wrestling act, and it was lifted directly from Boys Town.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, yes.
So I can well imagine that as an entertainer on the front lines, you could really blame the low interest in maybe the joke or whatever. And well, these people are worried about dying, so we're having a hard time here entertaining. But I could also think of, and this is a wonderful idea that the Army had, actually taking the mind of this off the soldiers. But my gosh, it's just, you don't know when there might be a sniper.
Well, they were within artillery and sniper range. They were not, within hand grenade throwing range, but they were within artillery range, and that figured sometimes. What you found with the audience was the main thing, because they were experienced combat soldiers, they would always look around for cover. They would always know where they were going.
Oh, absolutely!
If shit started to happen,
that's right.
And I mentioned that. In the book. But they very much appreciated these Jeep shows. By the way, the Jeep shows came about because a famous Broadway director, Joshua Logan, like most men, was in the Army, in the Morale Corps, and he realized that by November 1944, the American Army was on the German border, and they had great, and the frontline combat troops were fairly isolated. They had moved so fast. Mm-hmm. So he broke up these guys, these entertainers came over with this big Army show called Hip Hooray, and it had an Army band and all sorts of things. And they thought they were going to be playing this show in Paris, and which would be a great life if you're in the Army. And Joshua Logan came up with the concept of Jeep shows and said, no, we're going to put 3 of you guys in a Jeep with a driver, and we're going to drive you to just behind the front lines, and these, because the combat infantry is not getting what all the rear echelon soldiers are getting: shows and good food and even the best uniforms. I'm unaware of any, these enlisted men were all under orders, so it's not like they could say, I don't think I want to do that. This is the Army. You have to do what you're told.
Right.
And by the way, here's some names besides Mickey Rooney, the most famous 442. There's also Mel Brooks, and the rest of these. Mickey Rooney was, of course, world famous. But in the rest of these names I'm going to give you were unknown, 19, 20-year-old GIs who just happened to have some show business experience. So Mel Brooks, Sammy Davis Jr., Red Skelton, a famous comedian, some of your older listeners will know, Burt Lancaster, Dick Van Dyke, Don Knotts, and several others. It's
amazing. All of those people, just amazing individuals. Yeah. And a couple of them are still alive. It's just amazing.
Right. We are losing our veterans. We're down to the ones that have great longevity. But yes, I think Dick Van Dyke, for example, is still around and making noise. Yeah. So it was, and by the way, I have a theory which I'm not going to research because I do not want it to be disproven.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Sammy Davis Jr. was a black man. Well, the Army was segregated in World War II. Yes, there were black units, but there were no mixed units. Well, guess what? Sammy Davis Jr. was a black man, and he was in the Morale Corps, and that made it a mixed unit. So
interesting.
This is my theory that I don't want it disproven, but I say Sammy Davis Jr. desegregated the U.S. Army.
Hey, Jeepers, Tony here from the Jeep Talk Show. You know how you protect your phone screen with a protector? Now you can do the same thing for your Jeep, Bronco, Ineos, or G-Wagon. Windshield Defense by Racing Optics is a triple-layered, race-tested solution that installs in under 20 minutes, right at home or with your local installer. Made in the USA and trusted for over 25 years, it keeps your view crystal clear and your windshield safe from rock, debris, or whatever the trail throws your way. Don't let a rock end your ride. Protect your windshield, protect your story, and keep the adventure rolling. And now save 20% with code JTS20 at windshieldefense.com. That's windshieldefense.com, promo code JTS20. Born from racing. Absolutely. Well, it's like we don't care who's in this group. We need to entertain our troops.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that even back then, it probably wasn't a popular position, but even back then, I'm sure there were people in the Army that didn't agree with the segregation thing. Especially when you're trying to make sure you win a war. Don't be so petty that, the black people are trying to protect their homeland as well. Right. So, yeah.
In fact, that's a very interesting subject. General Marshall, the, superb, basically, highest level general said, you can, to Roosevelt, you can ask the Army to win a war, or you can ask an army to fight the civil rights battle, but we cannot do both at the same time.
Right.
And I guess he was, it was a different attitudes back then. And so anyway,
So let me just point this out. So you're a German, maybe a German soldier or just a person living in Germany. The U.S. troops are nearing or in your country, and they hear that the U.S. troops are putting on a show. It's like, wait a minute, these people are coming to our houses. They're gonna take care of the German army, which I'm sure some of the Germans were fine with that.
Oh yes, by then, yes.
And it's like, well, these people must be worried about taking us over because they're taking time to have some nice food and a show. So that would be a low morale thing for the country that you're invading.
Yes, the Germans were, they were. In the war, they were constantly faced with the abundance of the American army. The American economy produced more war material by 1943, end of 1943, than all the other belligerent nations combined. This show is about Jeeps. The American economy produced 650,000 Jeeps in World War II, gave about 250,000 of them to the Brits and the Russians, and still had plenty. So the Germans were constantly depressed by the amount of American equipment, that they had to face. And
we cheated because we would bomb their factories and make it even more difficult.
We tried to. Yes, our factory. Yes, it mattered a lot that our factories had the Atlantic Ocean between us. And Germany, but then,
and that kind of dictated the size of the Jeep. It's because we had to get those vehicles from the United States across the Atlantic and the Pacific as well, because they weren't just used in the European theater. So that had a lot to do with how the size of the Jeep, and how the weight. And I know it was well overweight for what the Army wanted. I do remember that.
Well, let me give you quickly what I know about the weight and the size. After World War I, as things started to heat up in Europe in the late 30s, the Army Quartermaster Corps was looking for something to replace the horse, and even for carrying messages, for pulling wagons, replace the horse, and then replace the motorcycle for message carrying and all that. Motorcycles were too noisy and too unstable. So they they found a company called the Bantam Car Company. And the Bantam Car Company, remember before there were many, many automakers back in the day, many, dozens.
Right.
And the Bantam Car Company made something called an American Bantam. And basically it was a version of a British mini car, just a small car. So the Quartermaster Corps had asked Bantam to make 70 prototypes of what became the Jeep. And it was not called the Jeep then. So Bantam made them. They basically, it was had a quarter ton. It was called a quarter ton truck because it had a capacity of a quarter ton, and then it weighed itself about a ton. So very light. 4x4 capabilities, of course. It's a Jeep, 2.2 liter engine, go devil, 60 horsepower, which sounds pitiful, but for when your vehicle is 2,200 pounds and it's meant to be going in low gear most of the time, it actually is plenty of horsepower. So the Army liked these prototypes, but they didn't like the fact that Bantam Car Company had about 500 employees and was kind of shaky on finances. So they involved two other companies, Willys Overland, and then that small company called the Ford Motor Company. Mm-hmm. They involved them in the bidding and basically ended up choosing Willys and Willys Overland design, and then split the production between Willys and Ford Motor Company because Ford could do it. Ford could handle it. So it came about, the Jeep was to be, a scout car, mostly replacement for the horse or the motorcycle. And I know your listeners are interested in modifications. Well, the Jeep was modified, as it got into battle, it was modified dozens and dozens of times, sometimes in the field, with a welding torch, mm-hmm. and sometimes, back in Detroit. But for example, one of the first things they put on in the field was a wire cutter, a steel beam going vertically in front, on the front fender, because there was fear. I don't know how real it was. There was fear that the Germans, as they got closer to Germany, would be
put up wires to decapitate
about head height. It was probably more likely that sagging telephone wires put up by the Signal Corps were also a danger. But
hey, it doesn't matter. Anything that's going to catch your neck or face.
Exactly,
yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And it's dangerous enough already without that.
Well, there's no roll bar because you can't have the weight. And absolutely. I'm sure there was lots of things that were done to those Jeeps.
In fact, Patton said that he said the Jeep was one of the most dangerous weapons the Germans had because of how badly the troops drove it. I'm sure there were fatalities.
All those kids out there, and they're worried about dying anyway. Well, screw it. Let's have some fun in this thing. So let me ask you real quick. I don't know if you have the answer to this or not, but four-wheel drive must have been something unusual for that period of time. I mean, there was tractors and things that were used on the farm, but those certainly weren't four-wheel drive. They just had two massive rear wheels that would give you the traction. So this would have really been the first time that a lot of people got to drive a 4x4.
I'm going to just have to speculate and say you're right. And I don't know what the initial four-wheel drive would have been other than possibly customized for logging companies and, take a Ford truck and customize it for mining or logging. But yes, that's a very good point. I hadn't thought about it.
We're going to talk with Sal, and I think this is going to be interesting to a lot of individuals out there. And I suspect that people that don't even have one of these Jeeps, all of us are curious about them and wouldn't mind having one if we had infinite garage space. So Sal is the owner-operator of Vintage Jeeps, a Pennsylvania company centered around the vintage Jeep community and a source for aftermarket replacement parts.
Interesting thing, too, is when you're working on, let's say, something like an old Jeep, right? They're very, very simplistic in design, and back in those days, Jeeps were meant to be rebuilt either by the dealership or the owner on a farm in a city and stuff like that. So it's a very unique mechanical working, if you would. And when it comes, I have a lot of the old Willys prints, or Willys, it depends on who you're talking to. But I have a lot of the old prints. And what's kind of interesting is to see the specifications, what they actually call out. And it's in, a relationship to why these parts are still around. And why these Jeeps can still be rebuilt, and why, 70 years later, you're like, well, how is this thing still on the road? And it was a completely, different time back then, from the metallurgical standpoint to how things are being pieced together, which makes it very, very unique. Mm-hmm.
So correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my opinion has always been that any vehicle that you have is infinitely rebuildable. There should be no time, no expiration date of a vehicle other than what you might get to the point where you have to build your own parts because the parts may not be available.
That's another thing. So, every vehicle, let's say in the vintage side of things, is completely rebuildable. The Ross steering box is rebuildable. Obviously the differentials, your most common areas, everything back in that time was marketed, and that was a big thing. It's marketed to be rebuildable. That was one of the selling points, that's how robust the unit is. And as as things started to grow, and even like when you get into the new stuff, some of the market is a little throwaway, but when you start throwing 70 plus or even 80-year-old parts like an old MB or GPW, you may have to whip out the lathe and the mill and start catering to variations and trying to make that work again. And that's also what makes it fun. Is, in looking at this, well, if I take this out and I put it back in, it should work. Not when it's 80 years old. We may have to shave a little bit off of here and take into account in that regard. But yeah, crazy.
Well, clearances aren't nearly as as tight as what they used to. I mean, the tolerances back then aren't nearly as tight as what they are now. So does that make it easier to make things work and make things fit together, or is it more hope and a prayer that I got it right?
So it's a little bit of both. So like tolerances back in the day was relative to the technology, right? So I get a little techie. So I'm going to get a little techie on you.
That's all right.
So an 80 weight, 90 weight oil needs at a minimum 4 thousandths worth of clearance in order to get in there and do its job. Okay. Now, when you're looking at, let's say, a transmission, right? And I do a lot of transmissions. Guys that follow me know I'm always diving into transmission. The tolerance on that could be, clearance at 8, 10, 13 thousandths, But here's the thing. There was no standardization back in the day. I mean, you're using, there wasn't multi-viscosity oil. It was 30 weight. Grandpa put 30 weight in. Nowadays we have 10, 30, 530 and so forth. But as the technology changed and standards, tighter tolerances came into play, which now means that when we're rebuilding something or playing with something, we have to mix the old with the new. So there's a lot of head scratching, like, oh, why is this not working? Well, the bearing that you have is tighter than maybe it was back in the day.
Right.
And we have to take that into an account. So
yeah, I can imagine it'd be quite a nightmare making things work, especially with the technology that's that old. So let me ask you this. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I'm really curious. Actually, let's find out the business that you have, Vintage Jeeper. You sell parts. What parts do you sell? For what Jeeps? Oh, and do you sell any Bronco parts? Because I got to ask that these days, because every Jeep company is selling Bronco stuff now. You don't have to answer that. I'm being facetious.
No, I think it's fine. And I'll dab into that a little bit. So primarily what we cater in is from 1941 to essentially 1972, which is the classic era of Jeep. So when you start diving into the Willys aspect, and then when Kaiser decided to take over, we dab in those parts. And they're anywhere from restoration parts to kind of get the job done to parts that we make ourselves, engineer ourselves.
Interesting.
Which is kind of right. So that's kind of my outlet into it. That's my fun.
That sounds like that would be fun.
Now we do get into some of the AMC stuff. So the neat thing is, as a small business, you can only do so much, right? So we have access to all of the AMC stuff. However, my niche is that 41 to 72.
Okay.
And the reason I chose that range is that kind of defined what the Jeep community is today. And if you look at a JKU and maybe you stare at the windshield or down at the rim, you're going to see that iconic military Jeep on there. And there's a reason, is that paved the way for what everybody's driving now. And interesting enough, when the troops were, fighting overseas, a lot of them messaged John Willis, right? And they said, how can we get this on the market? We want, this is a Jeep that's helping us through battle, in good times and bad and things of that. can this be offered here, in the States when we get back? And the interesting thing too is when you look at an old Jeep, you're going to see the data plate, and you're going to see it's generally known as like Jeep Universal. And you have an industrial scene and you have an agricultural scene. And the Universal is there because you'll see the old manuals will say Jeep Universal. And it's universal to those that are in the city and those that are in, farming life in rural areas. So it's a very unique, aspect. And that carried all the way until about 1972. Now, you did ask a question about Bronco parts. The interesting thing enough is there are a lot of interchangeability in some of the old Bronco parts. We'll snag some of that technology. When you start playing around with, Saginaw conversions and kind of the neat stuff, we'll snag a little part. We won't tell anybody, but we'll snag a part, we'll throw it on and call it our own. So there is some interchangeability.
A vintage Jeeper might feel dirty if they know the truth.
And that's the thing is, even back in the day, between old Jeeps and Broncos, there wasn't kind of too much of what you see today between, the Wrangler and the Bronco. I'm
sorry, when you say Bronco parts, you're talking about the 60s, the late 60s models. Not the current day.
No, we don't touch that stuff. We let you guys touch that, But the interesting thing is if you're going to narrow a Dana 44 and toss it in an old Jeep, right? So what you'll do is you can pick up a Wagoneer, what we call waggy axles, right? Narrow track. And we narrow them. We narrow the axle tubes or one side of the axle tubes. Well, what fits in that one side that we narrow? It's a Bronco. We take some of those Bronco axles and it makes it work, but majority of it's Jeep. So that's where we cater towards.
Right. And this is just, I would imagine when people start modifying their Jeep heavily, like what you're talking about doing, it makes it interesting going to an auto parts place and trying to explain to them what it is that you need. And I can imagine it's even worse with a 1941 to 72 Jeep and parts. You probably don't even go to our auto parts store for any of that stuff. Let me ask you this now, and in my knowledge of the older Jeeps is not very deep, so correct me on any of this, but weren't there 3 or 4 manufacturers of the early Jeeps? And how does that affect the parts that you go and that you're trying to replace?
Well, the interesting thing is, so, when we'll say the civilian era, so we'll say, late 45. Which is there are 45, CJs, Universals, but there were a lot of manufacturers that were contracted in to help build these Jeeps.
Right.
And here's the interesting thing: Purolator, Fram, Trico. Your transmissions were Borg Warner. You had Brown Lib, or Dana, and then which became Dana Spicer. And all these, when you go into, Walmart and you see a Fram filter, a lot of guys go in there and they see something different, a different type of mentality. I look at that and I'm like, that's pretty cool that they're still around.
Yeah, it is.
It's right. And same thing with Trico. Trico was making the vacuum wipers. Now, they're not worth a damn when you're going uphill and they're all vacuum, relying on just manifold vacuum. But it's kind of neat to see these manufacturers that are still around today that are building this. Even Carter. Carter was making carburetors for the Carter WO. That's a classic, iconic working person's carb it was meant to do 8 hours of manual labor to put the Jeep there. And even you'll look at some of the logo for like PTO unit, there's a chain and you'll see the Diamond logo, which is part of like Diamond Sugar, So there's a lot of hands after the war that wanted to be part of this iconic, vehicle. And just seeing it all come together and looking at everybody play together is so unique to the vintage Jeep community.
Now, you said something at the beginning of that I want to make sure I understand and to clarify. You referred to the Universal Jeep and CJ. Is the Universal Jeep the CJ?
It is. So, and CJ, yep. So the CJ, like if you ever look at an old manual, it'll say Jeep Universal on it. And the CJ, well, stood for civilian Jeep.
Right.
Now, after World War II, you're going to notice that on those military Jeeps, you'll see two indentations, and they were called Pioneer tool indents. And one had a shovel. We had one that had an axe on it. When you got into that early 46, late 45, but mostly with that early 46, they still kept that. They still kept the Pioneer tool indents, which makes it so unique to put a shovel and an axe, on the side. They did change to a 3 on the tree, which, oh gosh, if they could bring that was so cool to drive.
Really, the 3 on the tree? Because I like the on the floor shifter a lot.
That was, so the cool thing is it's a very complicated design. It didn't last very long in the civilian CJ smaller market. It did carry into the trucks, the wagons, the FCs. They started having 3, but it's part of the experience of owning one of these things. It's all about, which makes it a lot different than like stuff newer today, where you get in, you hit the button, and you go.
You're my friend. You're my new friend.